Well, welcome to Growth Track. This one is about the purpose and the practice of prayer. You see, we're going to be, for the next 4 weeks, looking at prayer from all different kind of angles. And my goal is that you will have a better understanding of prayer and that it'll deepen your faith journey. Now, I don't know what you're thinking of when you're taking this class, but I imagine this question is popping up in your mind, and that is this. Justin, am I the only one struggling with prayer? I think a lot of Christians, we feel and get stuck in this rut, this idea, am I struggling in prayer? But there's a reason why prayer is difficult. And Paul Miller made this statement in his book when he said this, that the American culture is actually probably the hardest place in the world to pray or to learn to pray. That's his observation, that the culture doesn't lend itself to help you and I as we are trying to deepen our spiritual life through prayer. Part of the reason is also what C.S. Lewis noted when he said, we live in a kingdom of noise, and he lived in the 40s, so I could only imagine what it's like today. And maybe you're wondering, does prayer even work? And maybe in theory you say yes, but practically you're not sure. You see, I feel like what we struggle with is this. Our struggle with prayer is really directly correlated with our lack of understanding of prayer. And so the more we get to understand and the more we put into practice prayer, I really believe that this could uncover something very beautiful in your spiritual life and in your faith journey. So let's talk about our approach to prayer. See, prayer isn't just an internal thing, and it's not just an external, it's both. It's both the inside work of the soul, but it's also the outside work of discipline. So you need both. So both dimensions. It needs the internal work and the external work and the discipline that goes along with it, which makes it kind of unique. Another thing about prayer is that prayer and relationship really do go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. It's not an isolation from life, it is life. And so a part of this class, hopefully, is to broaden your view of prayer. Now, if you're wondering, well, how are we going to be guided by this? How are we going to be deepening our prayer? Well, we're going to be looking to a great example. In fact, Jesus shows us how to pray, and we're going to be taking our cue from him. I love what happened in Luke chapter 11, verse 1, when there was one day that Jesus was praying in a certain place. So he's praying. And when he finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples. Which is a fascinating request, because you got to understand, at this point, these people that were following, these men that were following Jesus, they knew how to pray. They were taught how to pray. And yet, overhearing Jesus and how he prayed, they're thinking, we must be praying wrong. We need some guidance. We need some help. Jesus, teach us to pray. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this class. Jesus is going to teach us how to pray. So here's where we are headed. Each session is going to have a couple of videos, mainly 2 videos. The first video is going to be discussing the principle that Jesus teaches when he's teaching his disciples and us how to pray. And then the second video is going to follow up with real-world application on how to pray and take what Jesus taught into the real world. And so to start us off, I think this will be a great way to have a discussion with your facilitator, and that is this. Let's just be honest, and let's rate ourselves. If you were to see yourself on a scale of understanding and practice of prayer in your life, where would you put yourself? Would you be kind of in the lower section and maybe the 0 that says, what is the point of prayer? Maybe you're struggling in understanding what prayer is and why we even need to do it. Or are you kind of in the middle? You're motivated to pray, but you're just not really sure if you're praying right. Or are you kind of on the end there at the 10, where prayer is an essential, life-giving part of your life? So I'm going to hand it over to the facilitators and have a great discussion. In this short video, we're going to be looking at Jesus' first principle in regarding to prayer. See, Jesus talked to his disciples and taught them how to pray. And we see this in Matthew's gospel account in Matthew chapter 6, 5 through 8. And this is how it starts. He says, and when you pray, right off the bat, we notice that prayer is not really an option, but it's more, it has to be incorporated in your spiritual life. It's not if you're going to pray, but when you're going to pray. And when you pray, verse continues, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they will receive their reward in full. So kind of a cultural difference. I don't imagine that this is something that you may deal with. Most people don't like praying in public anyway. But in that day, this was a way to show off your spiritual acumen or how spiritual you were and how powerful your prayers were. And so this was a common occurrence where you would have these people praying in loud ways to just show off their kind of spiritual muscle there, so to speak. And so Jesus is like, don't take that approach. That's not the reward you want. You don't want to pray just because people think that you're spiritual. He says this. He says, this is what you need to do. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. This is a different kind of reward. This is a much better reward. This is how to pray. This is the purpose of prayer. It's alone. It's not seen. It's isolated. And in this space, there's a reward. Space in where you and your Heavenly Father are connecting. That is what it's all about. Now, the reward isn't about getting what you ask, because we know that's not the case. Because if that was the case, then all of us would be driving a Lamborghini. But the reward is better. It's a relationship. And so Jesus continues. He says, and when you pray, do not keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think they'll be heard because there are many words. So this is an interesting kind of a contrast that Jesus is using. He says, don't be like those religious leaders that want to show off their kind of spiritual acumen or that they have big, powerful words in their prayers. He says, don't pray like that. Pray behind closed doors with your Heavenly Father as you connect with Him. And then he uses this other way. He's like the pagans. He says, don't pray like the pagans, because in this context, especially in the first century, pagans, to get the attention of the gods, they would pray, and they would be using certain volume, and they would make carefully crafted words and sacrifices and promises. They believed they had the power to convince the gods to do something on their behalf. But Jesus is like, that's not the purpose of prayer. The purpose of prayer isn't to act like you're spiritual, and the purpose of prayer isn't to make God do what you want Him to do. He says the purpose is so much deeper than that. Verse 8 says, do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need even before you ask Him. So if prayer isn't about getting what you want, then really what is the purpose of prayer? Can I tell you in one little sentence? Prayer is about formation. And in this formation, there is a forming of a relational bond. That prayer is forming an anchor point, and prayer is forming a connection. Prayer is also empowering. Yes, prayer, and we'll get to that, is about your needs and what you need from God. But its primary function is the space behind a closed door where you're connecting with your Heavenly Father. And you know what? Jesus absolutely exemplifies this. I love it in Mark 1:35. As you know, in Mark's Gospel, it makes this notation that very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up and left the house and went off to, get this, a solitary place where He prayed. It wasn't a big show. It was this behind a closed door, or it was off in a distance. It was just Him and His Heavenly Father. Not distracted, It was solitude and quiet. Luke 5:16 said this, that Jesus often withdrew to a lonely place and prayed. It happened so much in Jesus' life that the gospel writers picked up on this. And so for Jesus, this is how it worked out. Prayer was about formation even for Jesus. It was this relational bond. He had to get away from the crowds and the demands of the crowds to reconnect with his heavenly Father. But not only was it a relational bond, but it was anchored. That Jesus did not lose himself when they shouted praises at him, and he did not lose himself when they shouted hate towards him. You know why? Because he had an anchor point. His anchor point was a connection with his heavenly Father, because he carved out time to always spend time with him. It was not only that, but it was a connection, right? Connecting, maintaining that close connection with the heavenly Father. And not only that, but it was empowering. He was empowered. His intake matched his outtake. I just wonder, as Christians, how many times we feel the tension of our outtake exceeding our intake. And what if we learn to have the discipline of having a consistent intake with our Heavenly Father? You know what would happen? Something would be formed in us. Formation. Jesus taught this and exemplified. And not just another spiritual practice, but this is how formation happens. This is how spiritual formation happens. And prayer is a vital part of that. As we saw in the previous video, Jesus created space to spend time with the Father. It was necessary for him. Just imagine how necessary it should be for you and I. So let's talk about forming this habit. First of all, we got to talk about that all of us are constantly being formed. We are constantly being inundated in and out by culture and people and friends. I love what Rich Villodas said when he said that we are formed by our false selves, our families of origin, the highly manipulated presentations of social media, the value system of a world that determines worth based on accomplishments, possessions, efficiency, intellectual acumen, and gifts. I think he's absolutely right. And if we're not intentional about our formation, someone or something will set us on a path. So, as a follower of Jesus, you and I have an example to follow. And as we follow Jesus, we cannot remove the influences of the world around us because we'd have to go into space, right? But we can be intentional about our time of allowing God to form into us to be the person that He wants us to become. That's why it's so critical for you and I to create a habit that's scheduled, that's a scheduled space to connect with God. So first of all, it's scheduled, right? And being that scheduled, it's going to be this daily Sabbath, this daily time of that it's scheduled. It's not spontaneous, right? And I'd like to give you a tip here. For me personally, I use a notification, a calendar, or even checklist. And you think, well, should it be spontaneous, Justin? No. When you want to be formed by something, you're intentional. And when you schedule it, whether it's creating a notification on your phone or have it in your calendar or even a checklist item, it's not a bad thing. You're actually being intentional. That's the beauty of it. So not only is it a scheduled, but it's a space. It's a time that is quiet. It's a time by yourself. It's something is forged and beautiful in a quiet place when we learn to reduce the noise. A tip here is to start off with a minute of silence. And this, we're actually going to have you participate in this. But to do just 1 minute, set a timer on your phone and do 1 minute of silence and just reflecting on God. You will quickly learn that your brain is not used to downtime like that. You're going to be fighting it. But when you do this, it's a beautiful time to prepare your heart. Not only is it scheduled, but we need to create that space. And I love what Mother Teresa said. This is beautiful. She says, in regards to prayer, she said, I don't talk. I simply listen. I think we should take a note from her to actually have some space where we don't talk. We just listen and reflect on God. So it's a scheduled, it's a space, but it's also a time to connect. You're not here just to occupy empty space, but you're there to commune with God. This is a moment that needs to be connected to the one you follow. I love what Henry Nouwen said when he said, solitude is a place where Christ remodels us in his own image, frees us from the victimizing compulsions of the world. And I think that is so true, because there are going to be barriers. When you want to schedule space, a scheduled space to connect with God, there will be barriers to keep you from doing this intentional time of prayer. One of the barriers will be busy. In fact, if we're not intentional with our time, something or someone will monopolize our time. And unfortunately, years from now, we will be formed into something, but it won't be the thing that we wanted to be formed into or intended to be formed into. So the purpose of this class is not only to teach you a new habit, but it's also to try to help you have a new mindset regarding prayer. And this is where the rubber meets, the road, where we not just talk about prayer, but we actually practice it. And we actually take a week to practice this new way we're learning about prayer. So here is forming our habit. Let's schedule it this week. This is your challenge for this week. When? When do you want to create some space, and where? Like when and where that you want to create space. Now, maybe for some of us, you're like, well, hey, I want to do it on driving to work or this. And those are fine times to pray, but this is not the kind of prayer we're talking about. We're really talking about creating some space of solitude and concentration. And so I want you concentrating on driving, not praying when you're driving, right? So in times like this, I have a space, and maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 5 minutes, where you could just focus in on God. And it's a place, maybe it's a walk, or maybe it's behind a closed door, or maybe it's in a place, a special place in your backyard where you just can connect with God. And this is what I want you to do, because we're building on this. So I want you to start off with a minute of silent prayer. And it's something as easy as setting a little timer on your phone where you can fully focus in on God, and not, is my minute up? And so the phone will go off when the minute's done, but it'll be an awesome opportunity for you to really prepare your hearts to go into prayer. Again, we're building on this. We're building this habit. We're creating a habit, and we're building on this habit each and every week. And so start off this week, every day, with a time of silent prayer between you and your Heavenly Father. And then you can also have a time of praying your needs and things that are happening in your family. But it's important to start off with a minute of silence before your Heavenly Father.